Hey class, Mr. Vashon here. This is not a feedback video. This is a lesson. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. This is absolute and comparative advantage. So here's the agenda for today when I'm gone. Number one, a dog of the day you can enjoy in the agenda. Number two, please complete this ed puzzle. It should be pretty straightforward to get into ed puzzles. The first one we're doing in this course, you pretty much just have to log in using your school email and to join the class, and then you should go straight to this video. If your classmates have any problems, please help them out. After you're done the ed puzzle, practice sheet. So 3.05 in your folder. I think I will have printed it out and given it to your teacher as well. And then you can do a self-take-up. So the solutions are also posted to the practice sheet in the agenda. And anything you don't understand, just turn to classmates and help each other until you understand it. Okay, and obviously I'll be there next class. We'll do a Kahoot next class as well, and we can talk about the practice sheet. And if you finish all of that and you're good, you can start to study for the Unit 3 test. We're done 3.01 to 3.05 after today, and the unit only goes up to 3.07. So you've done most of the content. You could get started on that. I left this yellow slide in just because I wanted to make this point about BBI or CIA. If you've taken Intro to Business or Economics, then you've done this before. Okay, so don't worry about any of this, but just keep that in mind today. This should be familiar to many of you, but don't worry if it's not. Okay, so let's jump in. So what are you learning? So describing forms of advantage as key concepts related to international business, and then calculating absolute and comparative advantage to determine optimal trade solutions in like a scenario between two simple economies. So this should make more sense when I review this slide at the end again. Okay, so today's lesson, absolute comparative advantage. The big idea, consider this question. Is it beneficial for every country to trade in a strictly economic sense based on this theory? Based on this theory, yes. So we're going to break down why absolute and comparative advantage demonstrate the sort of the importance of opportunity cost, specialization, and trade. So I think this will make more sense as we go forward. So the lessons about absolute and comparative advantage. What is absolute advantage? A country has an absolute advantage if it can make more of a product or service in terms of more productively than another country. So in a straight up sense, if Canada can make more cell phones than the UK, Canada has an absolute advantage in cell phones if it could do so at a higher rate of productivity. What do we mean by productivity? What does it mean for one country to be more productive than another? Maybe they use their resources more efficiently to manufacture a product. Maybe if they use the same amount of resources as another country, one country is able to make more of it. Maybe there's a technology advantage. Maybe there's a labor skill advantage. Maybe there's a resource advantage. Maybe there's a higher quality of resource that allows them to make more of that product. Okay, so let me give some examples and I'll hopefully make absolute advantage a little more clear. So take a look at the scenario, then we're going to answer the question, which country has an absolute advantage in apples and peaches? Okay, so it's a totally simplified example. Assume there's only two countries in the world relevant to this example, Canada and the US. Also assume they can each produce apples and peaches, and assume that's all they're producing. And if each country uses half of its resources to produce each product, here's what they could produce. So if Canada uses exactly half of its resources devoted towards apples and exactly half of its resources devoted towards peaches, Canada will make 1,000 apples and 600 peaches over some stretch of time. If the USA does the same, USA devotes all of its resources to make apples, half of its resources to make apples and half of its resources to make peaches. It'll make 800 apples, 1,400 peaches. When I say resources, again, going back to the last slide, that could be people, technology, land, etc. So which country has an absolute advantage in apples? Let's get to the questions here. So in apples, that would be Canada. Why? Well, if they're devoting their resources as such in a similar way, Canada makes more apples. Okay, which has an absolute advantage in peaches? The States, right? The States can just straight up make more peaches, or they can make peaches more productively than Canada. But let's get to some questions that will maybe allow us to start making some economic insights here and get more towards the heart of the theory, because that's pretty obvious. So to start off, in this scenario, they're each using, Canada and the States, half their resources to make these products. How many total apples get created? 1,800. And how many total peaches get created between the two countries? 2,000. Okay, so that's the total productivity if they're each devoting half their resources in that way. But is that optimal, is the question. So we know that Canada has an absolute advantage in apples and the States has an absolute advantage in peaches. What if instead, just to slide back to the last slide, what if instead of them each using half their resources to make apples and half to make peaches, what if Canada said, well, we're better at making apples, we have an absolute advantage. What if we just devote 100% of our resources to make apples? And then the States, which has an absolute advantage in peaches, what if they said, let's just devote 100% of our resources to make peaches? Well, here's what it would look like, right? So if US devoting half of its resources to make peaches got it 1,400, then if it took its other half of the resources from apples and put those towards peaches as well, they would double their peaches production, right? Because they went from spending 50% of their time on peaches to 100% of their time and resources on peaches. Same for Canada. Canada made 1,000 apples with half its resources, and now specializing makes 2,000. So the insight here to make a comparison is consider the totals. Before, the countries combined only made 1,800 apples. Now the countries combined have made 2,000 apples. Of course, they're all being made by Canada, but and in terms of peaches, before they only made, I think, 2,000 combined. If you added them up on the previous table, now they're making 2,800. So in this case, where one country has an absolute advantage in one good, and the other country has an absolute advantage in the other good, this is where specialization can kind of be demonstrated to be better for both countries. So if Canada just said, hey, we're just going to make apples, and then maybe we'll trade the U.S. half the apples. And then the U.S. said, okay, great, we'll just make peaches. And then maybe they traded Canada half the peaches. Overall, they're ending up with more apples and more peaches, right? So specializing leads to overall output being greater. And obviously there's an incentive then for the countries to trade together. Because again, they're just going to end up with more of, overall, goods, if that makes sense. So a takeaway here is if you have a situation, going back to the previous slide, where one country has an absolute advantage in one good and the other country has an absolute advantage in the other good, the optimal outcome in terms of getting both countries the most would be for them to specialize in whichever good they have an absolute advantage in and only make that and then trade together, and they'll end up with more overall. Okay, so that's how it works in a situation like this, where you have one country with an absolute advantage in one and one country with an absolute advantage in another. So that brings us to the second part of the lesson, comparative advantage. So take a look at the bottom now. Let's say here we have this breakdown. This might actually be more realistic, right? So let's say that the table just changes. So they're still the same in terms of the setup, but this time let's say Canada would only make 1,000 apples and 500 peaches, and the States would make 1,200 apples and 800 peaches. Well, what do you notice here? You notice that now the US has an absolute advantage in apples and an absolute advantage in peaches. So, how do you know which one they should specialize in? You can't just say, well, the state, Canada should specialize in neither and make nothing. And then the US, because again, you can't go more than 100% capacity. So how do you figure out which one each country should specialize in? That's comparative advantage. Okay, so comparative advantage is the ability of a country to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. Comparative advantage allows you to figure out in a scenario where one country has the absolute advantage in both, which is more realistic, again, because the States has 10 times the population of Canada, so it probably could produce a lot more of both products if it, because it just simply has far more resources. Comparative advantage lets you figure out which one each should specialize in to get you an optimal economic situation. Okay, so we calculate that by finding the opportunity cost of each country making each good. So I'll give you a bunch of examples and you'll try a bunch, okay? So this is really the bulk of the practice for today. So opportunity cost is the cost of giving up something to get something else. You might have heard this term before in other courses in economics. Opportunity cost is like the cost of more or less like not doing something. The cost of doing something in terms of what else you could have done instead, if that makes sense. Okay, so comparative advantage is needed, again, when one country has an absolute advantage in both. So I'm going to show you how to calculate this opportunity cost. So again, we have the same table as the last slide. And again, notice US has comparative absolute advantage in both apples and peaches. So we need to use comparative advantage, which we use opportunity cost to calculate to figure out, in this case, which of the two products should Canada specialize in and which one should America specialize in. So how do we figure that out? So let's look at opportunity cost. So in Canada, one peach would cost them how many apples? So in other words, instead of making one peach, in the time it would have taken them to make one peach, how many apples could they have made? The way you figure this out is you would divide the total apples over the total peaches, right? Because if Canada could make 500 peaches and 1,000 apples, then in the time it takes them, the time and resources it takes them to produce one peach, they could have produced 2 apples, right? For every extra peach that Canada makes, that comes at the cost of they could have used those resources to make 2 apples. How is it 2? Well, because the opportunity cost of a peach would equal 1,000 over 500. So you take the other product and you divide it by the product of the opportunity cost you're calculating. So here, the opportunity cost of Canada making a peach, opportunity cost of P, I'll say, is equal to 1,000 divided by 500, which would mean it would be 2 apples. 2A, I'll put. A is not a variable, it's 2 apples. In fact, I'll just put 2 apples. Okay? So you have to go through each of these boxes and make that same calculation. So what's the opportunity cost then of Canada making 1,000 apple? 1 apple. Well, you would do, so the opportunity cost, let me go over here. The opportunity cost of Canada making an apple would be equal to 500 over 1,000, which would be 0.5 peaches. Because for every apple Canada makes, it could have made half a peach, right? So I hope that makes sense. So we can go through this process. Let's actually finish it up and do this whole table. So then you calculate the opportunity cost for both boxes of the US as well. So the opportunity cost for the US to make 12 an apple versus a peach, you would do 800. You take the other one and you divide it by 1,200, right? 800 over 1,200, if you see that. So that would be 0.67 peaches. So the opportunity cost of an apple to the States is 2/3 of a peach they could have made. And then finally, I'll get one more color. So the last box, so you do it for all 4, the opportunity cost of America making a peach. So we're looking at this bottom box here now. Opportunity cost of a peach would equal 1,200 over 800. Right, you take the other one and you put it over, which would equal 1.5 apples. Okay, so let's circle each of the opportunity costs now. That goes here, and this goes here. So the way comparative advantage works is you calculate the opportunity cost of each country making each good, and then you end this problem by simply figuring out which country has the lower opportunity cost of each product. So let's compare the opportunity cost of each of these countries making peaches. Okay, so of each of these countries making peaches. So for Canada to make a peach, the opportunity cost was 2 apples, if you look here. For America to make a peach, the opportunity cost was 1.5 apples. So who has the lower opportunity cost of a peach? Is it 2 apples or 1.5 apples? It'd be US. So the USA should make peaches because this opportunity cost is lower than this opportunity cost. Okay, so the punchline here is US has the comparative advantage in peaches, which means that Canada will always have the comparative advantage in the other one, but let's double check. So in apples, the opportunity cost for Canada to make an apple, this is the green part right here that we calculated, was 0.5 peaches, and the opportunity cost of America to make an apple was 0.67 peaches. So who has the lower opportunity cost of making an apple? That would be Canada, because 0.5 is lower than 0.67. Okay, so you'd say then Canada has the comparative advantage in apples. So what we calculated here is that Canada should specialize and only produce apples, and America should specialize and only produce peaches. And if they were to do that, what you'd end up getting is actually the optimal solution that would get you the most of each good to each country. Here's also a take-up of what I just explained. So this was U for comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the ability of a country to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another. So this was all the different opportunity costs we just calculated. And you can see that Canada has the lower opportunity cost in apples. 1 apple cost them only 0.5 peaches. And America has the lower opportunity cost in peaches. 1 peaches only cost them 1.5 apples. And therefore, the optimal solution would be for them to specialize. Okay, so to wrap this one up, this is just some demonstration of what the country should do. So we just said that Canada has the comparative advantage in apples. Therefore, Canada should only make apples, right? And US has comparative advantage in peaches, they should only make peaches. So check out the totals, right? So if this is what the country should optimally do according to this theory, Canada shouldn't make peaches. They should let the US just make peaches because US has a lower opportunity cost of making a peach. And the US, therefore, is going to take all the resources they were making in apples and devote those to peaches. What you get at the end of the day here is both countries combined are actually producing like much more overall, or the optimal scenario overall, we could say, of the two goods. Like if you were to work out on a spreadsheet right now all the different scenarios and try to optimize, what's the maximum number we can get, you would get exactly what we get here, that you optimize production overall by specializing each country in what they have a comparative advantage in. Okay, so this scenario here with these two countries specializing in trading will get you the most product overall. Okay, so that's the lesson. So now practice for the rest of this, right? So basically, don't go to the worksheet yet. Work through these Edpuzzle problems now. Okay, so on each slide here, I'll pause it, and then some questions will pop up on Edpuzzle, and then I'll take it up after. So here's the first problem, and some problems should pop up on Edpuzzle now. So take some time to basically calculate who has the absolute advantage here with these products. And then that will allow you to answer the question as well as the comparative advantage. Okay, so problem number one here. Bob and Tom. Tom has the absolute advantage in both ketchup and mustard, right? Tom can simply produce more of both. So that means you need to calculate the comparative advantage to figure out who between Bob and Tom should specialize, like which one Bob and Tom should specialize in. Okay, so I'm going to put the opportunity cost then in each of these boxes. So the opportunity cost of Bob producing ketchup would be opportunity cost equals 0.5 mustard, right? Because 3 divided by 6 in a time to make one ketchup, he could have made 3 mustard, and then vice versa here. So the opportunity cost here of a bottle of mustard would be 2 bottles of ketchup. So I'll say 2K. Going down here, opportunity cost for Tom of making ketchup would have been 0.3 repeated bottles of mustard. And the opportunity cost for Tom of making mustard, opportunity cost here, 4 over 12. Oh, sorry, 12 over 4. You put the other one over top, would equal 3 bottles of ketchup. Okay, so you've calculated all the opportunity costs, and the person who should make each is whoever has the lower opportunity cost of making each one. So who should make ketchup? Well, who has the lower opportunity cost of ketchup? Okay, so Tom should be the ketchup. He should specialize and only make ketchup. And then in terms of mustard, who has a lower opportunity cost? Well, it should be Bob. Okay, 2 ketchup bottles is a lower opportunity cost than 3 ketchup bottles. So Bob should make the mustard. Okay, so the optimal scenario would be that. And that's an example of calculating it using comparative advantage. Okay, here is your next problem. Okay, so let's do a bit of a take-up then. So you can see here, there's an absolute advantage from one country in both products, turnips and sundials. Okay, so that means we're going to have to figure out using comparative advantage who should specialize in which. If again, remember, if one has an absolute advantage in one product, in turnips, but the other has an absolute advantage in the other one, then you know right away that what they should do is just each specialize in the one that they each have an absolute advantage in. Okay, so I hope I've made that clear. All right, let's calculate the opportunity cost of each then. So here, the opportunity cost would equal 0.3 repeated sundials. Opportunity cost of a sundial would equal 3 turnips. Okay. Here, opportunity cost would equal 0.5 sundials. Here, the opportunity cost would equal 2. It's actually the same numbers as the last problem. So, maybe I should have changed this one up a little bit more. Anyway, so let's just follow through and finish it up anyway. So, who should make which? Okay, so lower opportunity costs. This country should be making turnips. And opportunity cost is lower of sundials for this country. Okay, so sundial should be made by this country, and turnip should be made by this country. Okay, one more. Different numbers this time, so it's special. Okay, you can answer the questions that pop up. Then I'll take it up. Okay, so same process. One country, US in this case, has absolute advantage in both. So we need the comparative advantage, which means we need to go through and calculate each opportunity cost and then have each country specialize in the product in which they have a lower opportunity cost to get the optimal solution, which would be specializing only in that product in each one and trading. Okay, so here for clothing, this would be opportunity cost equals 5/12 of an airplane. Okay, here, opportunity cost equals 12/5, or 2.4, you could say, of clothing. Okay, for Brazil, opportunity cost here would equal 0.25, or 1/4 of an airplane, and the opportunity cost here would equal 4 of the clothing. Okay, so now we're taking in each. We're figuring out who has the lower opportunity cost. 12/5, 2.4 is a lower number than 4. So the U.S. should specialize in airplanes. And in this case, Brazil, 0.25, 1/4, is a smaller number than 5/12. So Brazil should specialize in clothing. Okay, so that would mean Brazil, clothing, USA, airplanes, in terms of what they should specialize in. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I know this is a simple lesson once you kind of get it. And whoops. And now we're just going to practice. A couple quick things before I end the video, though. Here's an extra video. It's not too long. If any of this was poorly explained, confusing, whatever the case, this is a good video you can watch as well. A reminder of what you're doing now. You're working through the worksheet independently. Solution set is posted to use after you're done. If you're done, you can study for the Unit 3 test. A reminder, I'll do a Kahoot with you next class. And hopefully this made sense. So learning goal again, we're looking at forms of advantage. So you should know what that means now as key concepts related to IB. And you'll succeed when you can calculate absolute and comparative advantage. Hopefully you feel comfortable doing that now to determine optimal trade solutions between two simple economies. Thank you, everybody. And thank you to the teacher covering. And just send me an email whenever you're good. Like if you need help, I mean. Okay. Bye, everybody.